Thank you all for attending the second round of the 2015 JDC West debate competition. At this point, we wish to remind all those in attendance that the audience participation in this debate is prohibited. Light sport is permitted in the parliamentary form of tapping on the tables. The recommended form is tapping with the fingers while resting the heel of the hand on the table. We remind spectators to keep this applause respectful so as to not interfere with the speeches. Any spectators deemed to be disruptive will be dealt with accordingly at the discretion of the JDC West staff with no warnings given. Please remain seated until the round has concluded and competitors have exited the room. Do not use cell phones or electronic devices at any point during the debate. Time will be kept by the official timekeeper, this guy. The start and end of protected time, as well as the beginning of the 2-minute rebuttal from the leader of the opposition, will be indicated by a slap on the table. The end of each speech will be indicated by 2 slaps on the desk with no grace period. A time card will be shown to indicate 30 seconds remain, and the final 10 seconds will be counted down with the following arm gesture. I will be your Speaker of the House and will direct proceedings. Without further ado, I now call this round to order. This round will feature Team H versus Team K, government opposition, on the resolution for you, which is, be it resolved that this House would ban the purchase of urban, non-new residential real estate by foreign investors. I now call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the House. As you can see, the resolution before us today is, be it resolved that this House would ban the purchase of urban, non-new residential real estate by foreign investors. Before we really get into it, I really want to highlight why this is important, what's the crux of this debate. And really, debate is about allowing future generations the ability to live in urban areas without worrying about the increased cost of living for Canadians. We want to make sure that Canadians are able to remain in urban areas. We want to make sure Canadians are able to stay where they are, and that's what we want to discuss here. So before we begin, I'd also like to outline some of the terms here today. So the first term is urban, and we've defined this as side government as highly populated areas. The second term being non-new residential, and we believe this to be old or previously established housing. The third term here is foreign investor. We've defined this as an international and non-Canadian residents whose main purpose of investing in Canada is not in relation to work. Now, before what we have today is a plan that we've outlined of how we want to do this. This will be followed up by 2 points put forward by side government. The first point being that this plan will decrease the cost of living for everyday Canadians. The second point being that this plan allows for an urban entrepreneurial mindset that will allow Canada to progress within the international sphere. So, as I'm going to start, I would love to discuss this plan with you today of how we're really going to implement this. And first of all, we want to put forward that this is not talking about rural or suburban areas. This is not talking about corporate investment, but really this is specific to real estate and residential areas that are highly populated. Some great examples of this would be in Vancouver or areas like Toronto, in the metropolitan areas that have a really high density where the cost of living is also extremely high. Vancouver, for example, was related to be one of the highest costs of living in the world last year. And this is really hard for everyday Canadians to afford. So imagine, you only make a certain amount of money before taxes, and then after taxes, there's even less, and then after that, we want to make sure that Canadians are able to thrive and support themselves in this environment. Yes?
Mr. Speaker, since demand is remaining constant, wouldn't this just force developers into suburban areas and reinforce the issue of urban sprawl we're seeing today?
I agree with that point right there, thank you. You know what, we're allowed to invest in rural areas, you know, we want to see investment in suburban areas. If you think about it, you know, there's a lot of areas that need more jobs, they need more corporations there, and they need people where they need to have jobs to supply to the economy. If you look at small towns, they only have those mom and pop shops, or even on the outer edges. Those places are perfect for entrepreneurs to set up camp. They are perfect for people who want to start those corporations, who want to be able to move and expand. If developers invest directly in downtown areas, they're not going to be able to afford it right now. They're not going to be able to allow their employees to afford their housing just because it's so expensive. The great example is Toronto right now as well. If you think about the cost of living, not only to purchase a place or to buy a place for an everyday Canadian, but also the cost of food. When you have people who are just, whose foreign investors whose main purpose is not to work in Canada, they are not contributing to the taxes, they're not contributing to the economy, they're not even staying in Canada year-round. Often these are just vacation homes or places for people to stay in for a few months out of the year. What we want to see is Canadians being able to live in these areas and being able to promote the growth in these cities. Furthermore, I want to point out that we want to grandfather this. So we're not saying that this is going to be implemented right away. This is going to be implemented in stages for Canadians. So what we're going to establish here is a program, once this bill is passed, a year or two from now, to say, hey, you know what, this is not going to be okay for foreign investors to buy in urban, non-residential areas only. And then what it's going to happen is decreases over time, so you can see this, that Canadians are able to actually purchase property here, able to live there, able to contribute to the economy in these urban areas where they need it. As Sai Government will further point out, this is really important for people who don't have large incomes, who aren't able to purchase property here and aren't able to live in these areas they once were able to. So with this, the Sai Government wants to help foreign investment in Canada that will help Canadians thrive. That is why this bill must pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, for speech, and I will now call upon the first member of opposition to give a speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand before you today as the first member of the opposition to deliver our opening arguments. We have three main pillars. I'll be discussing the impact on stakeholders, and my two colleagues, Brandon and Ben, will be discussing the next two. Before I get into my constructive speech, I'd just like to start off with two brief refutations. The first being with regards to tourism. It's been shown, actually, statistically in the past, that even a brief entry into Canada does boost tourism, so that's irrespective of how long a visitor's stay is. It still actually benefits Canadians and it benefits our economy. Now the second being, we've heard about this plan, we've heard the kind of utopian results that we're going to supposedly get from it, but we haven't heard anything about actually implementing this plan or how it's going to directly affect Canadians. So I'll now move on to my constructive speech, which has three main parts. The first being the impact to current homeowners, the second being the impact to prospective home buyers, and the third being that this resolution is in fact contrary to core Canadian values. So I'll begin with my first point here, which is the impact to current homeowners. Because this bill bars foreign investors from buying non-new residential real estate, this will actually encourage developers to build developments because that's where all of the money is. This in itself will actually drive down the value of existing homes and properties, because the resolution actually restricts demand for existing homes. Now this will force homeowners to sell for less and will reduce their actual net worth due to the depreciation of their current assets. The second point that I'd like to bring up is how this impacts prospective homeowners or home buyers. Now, because foreign investors can't buy existing homes, they have to purchase new homes. This will drive up the value of new homes, making it more difficult for young Canadians to actually enter the housing market if they're looking for a new home. Go ahead.
Would you not agree that if foreign investors are purchasing these homes at large prices that average Canadians can't afford, this is just going to be bolstering a market and not allowing Canadians to thrive in this scenario?
I would perhaps agree with that on a smaller scale, because although due to the scale and the magnitude of this, it's actually larger than the market capacity, and will actually make artificially distinct markets. So I don't think that actually applies in this case. So back to the prospective homeowners point here, is essentially it's forcing young Canadians looking to buy a new home out of the market, and perhaps forcing them into a position where they have to take a loan that they can't afford. So now onto the third point, which is that this is contrary to Canadian values. Give me a moment, please. Restricting housing for foreign investors to only new homes is a disincentive for foreign investors to actually move to Canada and help contribute to our growing economy. Furthermore, Canada has established itself as a melting pot for innovation and opportunity, and to be exclusive in any way is actually contrary to that belief and that value that we hold dear.
Would you not agree that, as said by the definition, this is for people who are not working in Canada and they're just choosing to buy this for an investment property per se?
Yes, I thank the member for the point. However, I still feel that this applies just due to the fact that they still would be purchasing real estate in Canada and contributing to the economy. So what have I talked to you about today? I went over the three main points of why we feel this resolution doesn't stand, mainly because there's been no talk so far as to the implementation of the resolution. And we discussed the impacts to the current homeowners, prospective home buyers, and the fact that this resolution is in fact contrary to Canadian values. So at this point, I'd like to hand over the podium to the next member of government. Thank you.
Thank you, first member of opposition. I now call the first member of government to speak.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, opposition. I'd like to start off by pointing out some of the obvious flaws of the opposition's arguments today. First off, the opposition stated that it has proven to increase the real estate market. If it is proven to increase the real estate market, it will allow for lower class to purchase homes, and it will. So what I'm saying is our plan will decrease this. Our plan decreases the cost of living for Canadians. Our job is to support Canadians and expand our economy. While housing costs increase, so does the standard of living. For single moms and students in urban areas, teachers, people with everyday jobs, people in the middle class, they can't afford it. We want people living in these houses that are supporting our economy, not foreign investors that aren't living in the houses, that aren't contributing to our economy. We want people that are paying taxes to be living in these houses. So, take for example, Vancouver right now. The average price for a detached home in Vancouver is over $1 million. This is insane. The average Canadian makes approximately $50,000 a year. How are they supposed to afford this? This Vancouver market was proven to be driven up by foreign investors from Asia, from other parts of the world. So if this bill is implemented, which it must be, the housing costs will decrease, allowing for the middle class to move into these these urban homes, and people that are contributing to our economy. Canadians can then afford the real estate. We want people contributing to the economy to live in these homes. One of the main reasons housing prices increased is because of foreign investors. The lower class will then, if this bill is passed, the lower class will then be able to afford safer living, and the middle class will be able to move into these urban settings, people that are contributing to our economy, paying tax dollars. So, this will also help decrease homelessness, because like I mentioned, the lower class, people that are struggling, it gives them an opportunity. If with a lower prices for real estate, it gives them an opportunity to move into safer livings, and this will help also boost our economy. Yes.
So the member explained to the House, if the demand is kept constant and supply is restricted, how costs possibly go down in terms of the housing market in Canada presently?
Currently, it is proven that we have examples like Vancouver, like Toronto. The housing market was already driven up by these foreign investors. Not at this time, please. It was driven up by these foreign investors. Like I mentioned, the average price for a detached home in Vancouver is $1 million. How are Canadians supposed to afford this, making an average of $50,000 a year? So, in summary, if this bill is passed, it will decrease the standard, or decrease the cost of living for Canadians, which will help boost our economy and our national economy and our global economy. It'll help students and single families, like moms, teachers, people in everyday jobs, the middle class, people, like I mentioned, contributing to our economy. It'll help them be able to afford this urban lifestyle. So if this bill is implemented, the costs will decrease, also allowing for the lower class giving them an opportunity, helping the homeless, giving them an opportunity to move in to safer living and secure living. So I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to pass it on to the next member of the opposition.
Thank you, first member of government. I now call upon the second member of the opposition to give a speech.
Thank you, Honourable Government, for your points here, but I stand proud to stand before you today to further propel side opposition's argument that this resolution must most certainly fall without hesitation. Before I begin my constructive points, I would like to refute a couple of the points brought up by the Honourable Side Government. The first point that I would like to bring up is they're talking about making housing more affordable for Canadians. While this may be true, what they're really doing is putting a ceiling on the quality of life for Canadians by only really allowing Canadians to enter into the market for pre-existing homes that will inevitably become dilapidated and ignored, which my colleague Ben will later discuss. We are forcing, or side government is trying to force Canadians to settle for less than they currently deserve. This happens in two ways. First, as Sam mentioned, a reduced net worth for Canadians. As soon as this bill is put into effect in these areas, their citizens' net worth will be cut dramatically simply because their assets are not worth nearly as much on market value numbers. Furthermore, the new residences will further increase the cost to Canadians because we just can't afford to have a quality of life at the cost that we are willing to pay. The numbers just don't line up. We will not be able to move into the houses that we really want to move into to aspire to the levels that we want to aspire to. And they're just imposing an artificial ceiling on our entrepreneurial needs. So on that topic, there was some discussion earlier about entrepreneurs moving in and starting up mom and pop stores in less populated areas. I feel that this is a massive misunderstanding of what an entrepreneur truly is. What side government was discussing is a small business owner. And really, if someone wants to start a small business in a small area, they're going to regardless. We need to be encouraging the people that have the entrepreneurial abilities, like these foreign investors, who may only be coming here for tourism purposes, to have and to use their abilities from their previous lives to really further the Canadian economy by coming here and seeing how wonderful it is and deciding that they do want to make their lives here. Furthermore, the taxes discussion, while it's true that we will not be collecting a marginal tax on these incomes, we will still be collecting tax on sales, property, and this is entirely new money that did not previously exist in our economy. This is a direct injection into the Canadian economy that we can better use to serve our Canadian citizens and improve our standard of living on a whole. So the fourth point that I would like to mention is the discussion of all the really massive housing markets where costs are really just completely out of whack. I believe that there's a misunderstanding of the effects of outliers on like a distinct sample size in Canada. So what they're talking about is people coming in and the average house prices in Vancouver being around $1 million. What we see happening is that the foreign people are coming in and they are investing in the extremely expensive houses, which are drastically increasing our mean cost of housing. We'll take you in a moment. And so what this means is that ultimately we should be looking at the median cost of a house and not the mean, because that is not really representative of what is going on in Canada. I just don't think that they understand the statistics of what is really happening here. You have a question?
I'm just curious how the $1 million detached home is an outlier here when there is such high cost of living in these concentrated urban areas, and specifically.
Well, just to use your point earlier, you discussed that Vancouver is among one of the most highly expensive places to live in all of the world. You could say that Vancouver in itself is an outlier, and to use that as an example is just not really representative of the case at hand. And so now, after we've heard from Sam about the impact on Canadian stakeholders as well as just stakeholders in general of this case, my colleague Ben will later talk about the economic considerations, and I stand before you today to discuss the impact of urban planning on this resolution. So, with a new incentive for developers to increase development of new homes as opposed to bettering and improving existing homes, what we're going to see is that developers will start ignoring the older houses and will start exclusively focusing on new developments. This is not what Canada needs. This is going to cause a lot more developments to come up that Canadians cannot afford because the prices are going to be so high due to these artificially distinct markets, as Sam was mentioning. So what's going to happen is the developers will start racing to purchase new land, which will expand the urban regions beyond their capacity and increase the number of inefficient pockets of civilization and society that really just will not have their needs met due to this increased urban sprawl. So on the topic of urban sprawl, what we see is that certain municipalities in certain regions have different ideologies regarding expansion and what needs to happen. So what could possibly happen in the future is that municipalities with a focus on growth will start trying to build up housing and build up everything surrounding there so that we can really attract these foreign investors, because they are going to want to come to Canada. This bill will not stop them. And ultimately, what this is going to happen is an interface problem between these different urban areas, these municipalities, because the older areas are going to be ignored because the people with money are going to be the people buying the new houses. And what this is going to cause is massive bottlenecks in infrastructure, leading to massive traffic jams, inability to fulfill health procedures at certain hospitals, as well as just general overuse and underdevelopment of existing infrastructure in Canada. All right, and so finally, with this increased demand in underdeveloped areas and massive bottlenecks, this leads me on to my next point, which is the potential for quality concerns. Because there is going to be so much of a race to procure land and to really start developing on it, we're going to see people trying to take shortcuts. And what's going to happen is, because all the labor that goes into assessing a real estate site, surveying the land, making sure that everything is up to code, they're going to be overworked and they're going to be undertrained just because of this increase in demand. This is just going to cause a systemic problem that is economic at its basis, in that we're not going to have the supply of people to fulfill these roles, and the demand is far going to outstrip this. So, for these reasons and the reasons previously presented, I stand proud to oppose this resolution. Thank you.
Second member of opposition, I now call upon the second member of government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. I'd like to start off today by presenting some clash, answering some questions that the side opposition has, and then I will move on to my own argument and reasons as to why we've clearly won this debate. So first of all, some clash. First opposition asked a few questions. He asked about implementation. Let me tell you a little bit more about implementation and what side government might have missed out from our first speaker, who clearly mentioned the implementation of our plan. So the plan to ban purchase of urban non-new residential real estate from foreign investors is to move it on a yearly or a stagedly basis. This plan will go in stages because it is dramatic, but at the same time, we'll grandfather it in. Therefore, foreign investors who currently have housing in non-new residential real estate areas will be able to keep their houses, and grandfathering it in simply means that any new foreign investors after a certain period of time will not be able to purchase this non-new residential real estate. Side opposition also asked how this will affect Canadians. Well, our second speaker clearly mentioned how this will affect Canadians, and it will affect, if we allow this to continue, it will negatively affect Canadians because the average cost of living will dramatically increase, as we've already seen in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, as well as corporations will have less incentive to stay in Canada, less incentive to move in Canada, and less incentive to do business in Canada. And this is a point I will expand on more with my own contention. Side opposition also said that we are this plan is contrary to Canadian values. However, our plan simply protects Canadians. It protects Canadian citizens, allows Canadian citizens to lower the cost of living in areas where we've seen high increases in that, as well as keeping Canadian businesses in Canada and allowing businesses to move to Canada, which will obviously help Canadian citizens, which is a key value for Canada. Now, the second speaker also talks a lot about Canadians settling for less than deserve. They say that Canadians will be forced to move into non-new residential real estate, which is run down, which is terrible housing. However, this non-new real estate is not necessarily run down. There's plenty of beautiful non-new houses. Just because it says non-new in the resolution does not mean these houses are run down or beat down, are terrible houses. In fact, there are beautiful houses in residential areas that Canadians can still buy and that they will be able to deserve. They will not be settling for these houses. In fact, they will be getting great houses in great areas. Furthermore, we mentioned, not this time please, our second speaker mentioned that the average Canadian makes $50,000 a year. However, from recent statistics, $1 million, in Vancouver, the average family house is over $1 million now. So settling for less than deserve is what the side opposition asks. However, an average Canadian can't even afford these houses. So this plan will help Canadians because they'll be able to purchase what they do deserve, instead of the increased cost of living and purchase what they cannot deserve. What they cannot achieve, I'm sorry. Furthermore, first and second speaker also mentioned that foreign investment in urban areas increases tourism, which increases the money in Canada. Now, I do agree that tourism does increase money in Canada. That's not up to contention. However, foreign investors who move to these urban areas without business-related intentions is wasting money for Canadians, increasing the cost of living, like I've mentioned, and buying a vacation house that drives up prices is definitely not good for Canada. Second opposition speaker also talked about how Vancouver is not an accurate representation of the case at hand. However, I believe exactly the contrary, because Vancouver is most definitely an example of the case at hand. We've seen in Vancouver foreign investors investing lots of money in Vancouver, in housing, in real estate, things like that. However, this has actually increased the cost of living. Like we've said, it's been detrimental for Canadian citizens, and this is a prime example, as well as Toronto, things like that. Second speaker also talked about urban sprawl. I believe that side government believes that sprawl in cities like Vancouver or Toronto will be detrimental for Canadians and beneficial for foreign investors because, like we've been mentioning, cost of living goes up. The average Canadian citizen actually has a worse life because of the foreign investment. Now that I've finished this clash, I'll move on to my own argument. Now I'll be arguing today that our plan allows for urban entrepreneurial mindset. With our plan, we will lower the cost of living for Canadians, which in turn will be favorable for entrepreneurs who are currently in Canada and ones interested in coming to Canada. Now, Vancouver and Toronto, which are prime examples, like I've said, are some of the worst urban areas for entrepreneurs in Canada. Many entrepreneurs are fresh out of university or college. They have great ideas. They're smart people and brilliant minds. And they need the ability to develop their ideas. We've seen this type of development in areas in the Bay Area, near San Francisco, Palo Alto, and California. This area allowed for young people, university students, to come out and get their ideas on the table. And they have the resources and the networking and the ability to develop these ideas and eventually make money for their communities. Now, We don't, for people who are fresh out of university, entrepreneurs who have these great ideas, they don't want to move to rural areas like Medicine Hat or Thunder Bay. While these areas may be great in their own regard, they're not the best for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs like urban areas with high populations, with ability to network with people who are business people who are experts, people who know more than them. And they have great resources in urban areas, like places like Vancouver or Toronto, things like that. Now these cities that we've been mentioning are extremely expensive for entrepreneurs for many reasons. And these entrepreneurs are generally young people who don't have the money to spend on things like housing prices or everyday goods, foods. These people are forced to live in far-off suburban areas. And the transportation from those areas to their offices or their work within the cities is also an expense that they cannot afford, and we should not make them afford because of foreign investment. Now, with our plan, corporate offices will also be less expensive for entrepreneurs, which is beneficial because the cost of business and the ability to do business is cheaper, and business will be more successful for these entrepreneurs. This will attract future business to Canada. Cities like Vancouver or Toronto, which many people consider now to thrive, are actually not thriving because they're not sustainable. Our plan allows these cities to thrive, but also allows them to stay sustainable, which is incredibly important in the day that we live. Now, people want to live and work in these places, and most importantly, our plan will allow them to do that economically. This is why this resolution must pass. Thank you.
Now call upon the leader of the opposition for the 5-minute speech and 2-minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand before you to deliver the final arguments for side opposition today in relation to the resolution brought forward by the Honourable Prime Minister. Be it resolved, this House would ban the purchase of non-new residential real estate by foreign investors. Now, today, we'll have a plethora of clash to go through today, from we heard from the government today, sorry. I'd first like to discuss a couple economic considerations that really haven't been brought much in this debate, but I believe are fundamental to the people who are impacted by this resolution. First and foremost, before going into this, I think I should reiterate the underlying demand and supply considerations that we've been talking about today on side opposition. First and foremost, what we're talking about here is artificially segmenting the supply of homes in Canada. Demand will remain consistent. Foreign investors, given Canada's business climate, will still come to Canada. Residential, Canadian, domestic buyers will still be in Canada because, of course, it's a great deal of paperwork to deal with to go through immigration. What we ultimately have here is a demand that stays constant, but a restricted supply in one industry, and a supply that is ultimately built on the backs of external costs, as has been discussed by my partner Brandon. So, but it's because of this artificial segmentation, we see this as a detrimental effect to Canada in the long run. Moreover, I'd like to just touch on, again, briefly what Brandon discussed, thus being the external costs associated with development. What this model does is it forces developers outside urban areas and to create a large sprawling suburbs. The reality of this is, we believe, it ultimately amounts to a bit of artificial stimulus to the economy. An example of this on a wider scale, which I believe parallels perfectly to this one in the Canadian example, is China. For example, to fuel their 7% GDP growth, what China is doing is basically building cities where no one lives. So yes, while the demand may be constant, might have some movement into these homes on the peripheries, what we see here is that ultimately it might come at the cost of artificial growth. Now, what I really think has not been mentioned here is immigrants, people who have made Canada the country that it is today. For example, consider the following. Many immigrants who come here for economic reasons must hold a certain amount of assets prior to entry into Canada, prior to having a job, excuse me. So the reality is here, in the 1 to 2 year timeline that side government has been discussing, these individuals must purchase a house and must hold it in order to get a job later on to help the Canadian economy. Oftentimes these new developments might be unaffordable or not in an area where that job might be had later on. So ultimately what we're doing here is providing a non-tariff barrier to hardworking immigrant families who can assist our economy. Lastly, what I'll speak to in a moment here, is that under Canada's free trade obligations with Europe, China, USA, and many other nations, we require to not have non-tariff barriers in place to permit foreign investment. And while, yes, we are focusing on residential properties and people who are not necessarily primarily concerned with working, what we see is that this ultimately amounts to a non-tariff trade barrier, and something that side opposition fundamentally disagrees with Canada's legal obligations at home and abroad. But I'll take your POI now.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I would like to see what opposition says about the increased cost of living and how that will affect the average immigrant who often doesn't have as much money as the average Canadian.
I think it's brought up in a POI, Mr. Speaker. Because of this artificial segmentation of the supply and the recurrent and maintained demand, ultimately we don't really understand how, in fact, any reduction in living costs will ultimately amount from this model. And I'll get into this more as I discuss the reputation for today's debate, but what I really want you to dwell on, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that when demand is staying constant, no matter how you MacGyver the supply chain, you're still going to have high prices. Given the good business environment that Canadians have created over years and years, businesses value Canada, and despite what nominal living differences there might be, we believe it will remain strong in the years to come. But moving now on to my constructive rebuttal, if you will. First, I'd like to discuss this idea that we've dwelt on, this example from Vancouver. And Vancouver, I must admit, is an ideal example of this resolution in action, but I admit it is a bit on the extreme side. Canada is, or Vancouver rather, is amongst one of the most expensive places to live globally. And on that front, we believe that there are other areas where, in fact, this resolution could be applicable. For example, urban areas like Saskatoon and Regina, where a thriving natural resources market will soon fuel foreign investment. And these are smaller, densely populated areas, but of course we don't see the same high level of housing and living prices as we see in these areas. So in fact, this really hasn't, the side government hasn't tackled how these areas fit into this, and we believe they will be fitting through the cracks, even though they are poised to set Canada's economy into the years to come. I'd like to just briefly discuss again this idea of entrepreneurship we heard from the honourable member who just spoke before me. He said that if we have low standards of living, ultimately what results is that we have Canadians being able to function in the Canadian market. While I agree with this point very, very strongly, I believe we should foster Canadian entrepreneurship. What I think is missed here is that many great ideas, unfortunately, are not Canadians. But that doesn't mean that Canadians can't put our expertise together to bring these ideas up and make them even better than they can be. So simply restricting what might occur, might stimulate our economy in terms of these entrepreneurship and the better opportunities for entrepreneurship, parallels perfectly for foreign investors. We need not sacrifice all the innovation that can come from global cooperation than just by focusing on one sole group. What does this debate truly come down to today? I believe it's come down to the question of how do we best maintain long-term growth and affordability in Canada. What we heard from the government side today was that we were going to restrict foreign investment and artificially segment a market that was functioning very well compared to many around the world. And frankly, their hope was that in 1 to 2 years, and I quote, 1 to 2 years, there might be some sort of beneficial changes to Canada's housing market and the cost of living. Well, the reality is that Canada is a great nation, but we are simply too small to do it alone. We thrive on collaboration with others. We thrive on a connected, integrated environment that values all individuals, no matter where they come from, no matter their creed or color. We believe, on side opposition here, that the supply and demand allocations for our housing needs are working not at a complete optimum, but in a way that is quite phenomenal compared with other systems in the world. Frankly, we considered and studied the external costs and believe that we are making changes, or rather maintaining programs that have made Canada competitive in the world. Mr. Speaker, Winston Churchill once said, "Never in the course of human history has so much been owed by so many to so few." And Canada is a nation that thrives on collaboration and investment on the foreign investors, on all individuals working together in a place that makes Canada better while making the world better. So for these reasons, I stand proud to oppose this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have called all 5 ministers to give his 2-minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what I really want to establish today is that we as side government want to see Canadians thriving here in Canada. This is very specific here in terms of foreign investment as well. We're talking specifically about the urban area. We're talking specifically about non-new residential areas. And we are not limiting foreign investment, we're changing it. We're not asking people to not invest in Canada. We're not asking foreign investors to move away. We're asking them not to buy residential homes that are taking away from Canadian living standards. And really, that is what it's all about here, Mr. Speaker. There have been some really strong assumptions made by side opposition here. They've stated things like there will be overworked and overtrained people in suburban areas. They're talking about suburban sprawl, all of these things. Right now, foreign investors are able to invest in suburban areas right now. They are continuing to be able to do this. What we're simply saying is we want to limit in urban, non-new developments so that way Canadians have the ability to move into these areas, to make a difference, and to be able to stay in their own homes. This is what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker, and this is the crux of the debate. We want to see Canadians living where they want to be. We want to see Canadians thriving in the economy, and we want to see Canadians doing well. This is exactly what we see, and for these reasons, this bill must pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, side government and side opposition for your arguments. I now call this round to close. Audience, please remain seated until all the competitors have left the room. I now invite you all to go shake hands.
We're supposed to be building this, correct?
Yeah, just kind of like
The audience can get up if they want.